back, everyone. This is the 7th and final panel of the 2022 World Bioeconomy Forum. This panel continues the theme of climate change and the role of the forest bioeconomy, with an emphasis on market solutions and policy development. To kick off this panel, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Jim Hourdequin. Jim Hourdequin is the Managing Director and CEO of Lyme Timber, leads the company's investment and business strategies. Over the past 17 years, he has managed the acquisition over 1.8 million acres of timberland throughout US and Canada. Jim has a background that combines forest ecology and business operations and has led Lyme's strategic focus on timberland opportunities that combine conservation transactions, climate strategies, and supply chain investments, including sawmills and logging operations. He serves on the board of the National Alliance of Forest Owners and the Finance Committee for the Montshire Museum of Science. Jim earned an MBA from the Harvard Business School and a bachelor's degree in biology from Dartmouth College. In a recent interview article in Bloomberg, Jim was critical of the current state of the voluntary carbon market, which was picked up by several other media outlets. And so I look forward to hearing about his perspective and a possible vision of where carbon markets may be headed. Jim, the floor is yours. Jim, you're still muted. Sorry.
Okay. Am I no longer muted?
You're good.
Great. I apologize. Well, thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk about the direction of the forest carbon offset markets and their potential as a long-term climate solution. But before I begin, I'd like to stipulate that my experience is largely limited to carbon markets in the US, which to date have been dominated by improved forest management projects under the California Air Resources Board protocol. More recently, we've begun exploring the voluntary markets, which many believe will experience significant growth over the next few years. As I'll discuss, I'm less confident that these markets are delivering real climate value. This makes me skeptical of some of the more aggressive growth projections, especially with respect to improved forest management projects on existing working forest lands. However, these doubts do not extend to carbon offset markets more generally, as I have no experience with carbon markets outside the US, and I certainly appreciate the potential for forest offset markets to help conserve threatened forests and to finance reforestation and afforestation in the tropics and other regions that have experienced forest loss in recent decades. Let me start with a little background on the Lyme Timber Company. Our 1.4 million acre forest land portfolio is built around 6 businesses, all of which include significant naturally regenerating forests. Although we've owned natural forests in California and the Pacific Northwest, our current portfolio is spread across the eastern US and includes plantations in Florida, oak forests in the Appalachian region, and northern hardwood forests in the Northeast and the Lake States. Because our portfolio includes naturally regenerating forests that are important for conservation, we've been active in land conservation and carbon markets. In just the last 3 years, we've sold over $50 million of compliance offsets from 5 different projects on 200,000 acres of our portfolio. The conventional wisdom is that forest carbon offset markets will experience tremendous growth over the next several years. While no one expects offsets to be the primary source of climate mitigation, many believe that nature-based solutions will be a critical component and near-term bridge solution for companies that cannot achieve net zero through emission reductions alone. Some studies estimate that over 1/3 of climate mitigation will come from land-based projects, and forestry projects have accounted for the vast majority of land-based projects to date. The volume and value of voluntary market offsets more than doubled from 2020 to 2021, and several analysts have forecast that the market could accelerate from here, resulting in higher offset prices and potentially transforming forestry investment in the US and beyond. At the same time, and despite what appears to be growing interest in investing in forest land as a natural climate solution, there have recently been several high-profile criticisms of forest carbon offsets. Articles in science journals and the popular press have questioned whether compliance and voluntary transactions have accomplished their purpose to take carbon dioxide out of the air and thereby offset carbon dioxide emissions elsewhere. A Bloomberg article pointed to the Nature Conservancy's selling of offsets on lands that were unlikely to be harvested due to their conservation status. Just a few weeks ago, the comedian John Oliver ran a segment that took the entire carbon offset industry to task, pointing out its many inconsistencies and highlighting projects that deliver little or no climate benefit. Much of this criticism questioned the additionality of offset projects and whether the projects required real changes in behavior rather than simply quantifying theoretical carbon sequestration gains against a hypothetical scenario that was unlikely to occur. In an honest assessment of many other carbon projects, including some that Lyme has developed, is that while legal and fully compliant with the protocols, they may not have required the forest land manager to reduce near-term harvest levels relative to historic levels or change management practices to increase carbon sequestration. Historically, we approach carbon the way most landowners have. Carbon developers came to us with carbon assessments. Then we considered the trade-off between the upfront initial issuance payments and the ongoing obligations under the proposed project. In some cases where the upfront payments was large and the impact of future harvest levels was relatively small, we decided to proceed with the project. In other cases, the economics simply did not work and we decided to pass. In 2021, we decided to approach carbon offsets from a different angle. Instead of thinking about how to maximize offsets under the rules of a given carbon protocol, we focused on how we could significantly increase carbon storage on properties we own. Essentially, we modeled harvest reductions and rotation extensions relative to our existing planned operations, our own internal baselines. We then calculated the financial impact of implementing those changes over a 40+ year compliance period in the voluntary market and translated this cost into a price per ton for carbon removal and emissions reductions. We conducted this analysis on our lands in Michigan, Florida, and West Virginia. Our conclusions, which I presented at the annual Who Will Own the Forest conference on forest land investment last year, and which were reported in the Bloomberg article that Mark referenced, were that the current price of carbon does not compensate for or incentivize immediate behavior changes that would result in greater carbon storage on commercial timberland in the US. While our commercial forests do store a lot of carbon, and some have and will continue to accrete carbon because growth is greater than removals, these climate benefits are likely to be realized whether or not the property is enrolled in a carbon offset project. In the US, it can be argued that carbon markets have paid landowners to not do what they were already not going to do. Consequently, many forest carbon offset projects have probably delivered relatively little carbon storage and climate benefit. Based on our calculations, the price of carbon would need to be much higher, between $30 and $75 per ton, to incentivize the kinds of management changes that could result in actual carbon removals and greater carbon storage relative to realistic baseline scenarios. This wide range of carbon prices is dictated by individual property features, including the value of wood products, demand for land sales, and any encumbrances on the property, such as a conservation easement that may have already extinguished certain option values. I noted that although they have not had to change near-term management practices to sequester and store more carbon, the landowners who have enrolled properties in carbon projects have, by and large, not extracted rents from the market. Instead, they have been compensated for encumbering their properties with 40 and 100-year agreements that do protect the land and result in several biodiversity and climate benefits. On the properties we have enrolled in carbon projects, we've had to reduce the size of clear cuts, maintain third-party forest certification, and we've given up the right to sell off retail land parcels. These obligations represent real costs and they result in real conservation benefits, even if they don't result in greater carbon sequestration and carbon storage. I have said that purchasing carbon offsets is like walking into a beer hall for a pint of beer, but being served a fine meal instead. Not surprisingly, John Oliver came up with a better analogy. It's like if you ask your husband to pick up the kids at school and he comes home childless, but with a pizza. You're not mad at the pizza, but he didn't do what you asked him to do. In the world of improved forest management offsets, I think we've conflated climate benefits with pizza and beer. Conservation NGOs, policymakers, and many in the carbon offset industry have given forestry projects a pass on meaningful carbon removal and climate mitigation because the projects have protected forests and delivered so many important conservation benefits. Since my Who Will Own the Forest talk and the Bloomberg article, we have continued our work to evaluate the true cost of increasing carbon storage on existing commercial forest lands. On our Florida plantation lands, for example, we modeled spatially explicit harvest deferrals and rotation extensions that would increase standing carbon stocks by 50% over a 10-year period. This more detailed work supported our earlier analyses that the price of carbon needs to be well above its current levels to both incentivize project enrollment and incentivize on the ground and immediate management changes. But our more recent work has also pointed to some other challenges facing improved forest management projects on commercial forest land, which I'd like to briefly describe. I've grouped these challenges into three categories. One, the leakage problem, two, the significance problem, and three, the capital efficiency problem. Leakage is the concept of harvest reductions on one property resulting in increased harvest levels somewhere else, with the result that there is no net increase in carbon storage. The compliance and voluntary market protocols have adjustments for leakage, 20% in the compliance market and 30 to 40% in the voluntary markets. But critics have argued that leakage rates may be much higher, potentially as high as 95 to 100%. Wood fiber and wood products are global commodities, and harvest reductions in the US may well increase harvesting in other parts of the world, potentially in regions with fewer regulations and environmental protections. On a more micro, localized level, we know that pulp mills and sawmills are fixed cost businesses with large procurement zones, and over the short term, they are not going to change their consumption patterns in response to harvest reductions on any one land base. The second problem is what I will call the significance problem. And by this, I mean the absolute amount of additional carbon storage that results when you utilize an appropriate baseline and properly account for leakage. On our Florida property, we modeled a 50% increase in standing carbon over a 10-year period. But despite this significant management change, after accounting for leakage and our realistic business as usual baseline, we generated less than 0.5 offsets per acre per year over the first 20 years of the project. By my rough calculations, it takes management changes on over 400 acres of our land to equal the carbon storage benefit that would result from installing solar panels on just 1 acre of land. In short, it's hard to see how management changes that increase carbon storage on current industrial timberlands, when properly accounted for, are going to move the needle on climate. The third problem is a little less exciting and follows from the first two. It's the idea that it's not particularly efficient from a capital allocation standpoint to invest in carbon sequestration on commercial timberlands. If you are going to buy the land and timber, the amount of climate benefit per dollar of investment just isn't that great, unless you make unrealistic assumptions about what would have happened to the forest in the absence of the carbon project. Investing in commercial timberland for the sole purpose of sequestering more carbon is like buying a skyscraper so that you can put solar panels on top. Now let me close with some concluding thoughts and what this could all mean for the bioeconomy. One observation I'd make is that there appears to be a growing fatigue within the conservation and scientific community with forest carbon offsets. I attended the Trillion Trees US chapter conference earlier this year and heard several conservation leaders lamenting the fact that efforts to increase biodiversity, water quality, and land rights all need to be framed through the lens of carbon offsets as co-benefits if they are to garner support and corporate funding from companies with net zero commitments. Perhaps we need to move away from carbon offsets to something much broader, a nature credit, one that makes fewer claims about carbon removal and better incorporates the many co-benefits of conserving land. Alternatively, we could renew our commitment to regulations and legal instruments that conserve land. In the US, we have for decades utilized working forest conservation easements to secure multiple public benefits: water quality, biodiversity, public recreational access, older forests, and even carbon storage from forests. The recently passed Inflation Reduction Act adds a record amount of federal funding, over $700 million over the next 5 years, for the Federal Forest Legacy Program, a well-established funding scheme for conservation easements that already provides $90 million a year for forest land conservation. My hope is that these sources of funding for land conservation will enable the conservation community to be a bit more clear-headed about the real climate benefits of IFM projects in the US. And this brings me to the bioeconomy. This is an area where managed forests, specifically continued intensive and responsible management of forests, can really contribute to climate. Mass timber, new uses of wood for packaging, insulation, and other materials, alongside traditional uses of wood for furniture, flooring, and buildings, all present opportunities for carbon storage and for the displacement of more CO2 intensive materials. Where applicable and based on sound science, wood industries need to do a better job documenting, but not overstating, the climate benefits of wood relative to alternative materials. At Lyme Timber, we've been supporting research, including research at Michigan Tech into hardwood cross-laminated timber, and we're excited that some of the leading companies who have made climate pledges, including Walmart, Microsoft, and Amazon, are exploring how they can utilize and incentivize greater use of wood in construction. While it's exciting to think about commercial markets for wood, we also need to think about thinning forests to reduce fire risk, even when we don't have markets for the harvested wood products. The need for biochar and biomass markets has gotten a lot of attention, but in many regions, these may not be scalable businesses and their carbon footprint may not be particularly good. We've been working with a group of researchers from the Yale Carbon Containment Lab to explore ways to harvest dead or fire-prone trees and then bury them or pile them on site in ways that minimize decomposition and thereby maximize carbon storage. Developing harvesting systems and a workforce to perform this work will be critical to long-term success in mitigating the climate and environmental health impacts of fire on forests in the Western US and beyond. And that brings me to the end of my remarks. To summarize, I remain skeptical that forest carbon offset markets will live up to the expectations that many have set for these markets. The price is way too low to drive real behavior change. Leakage is a real issue. And when you set realistic baselines and fully account for leakage, it turns out that harvest reductions and changes in forest management practices on commercial timberland in the US may not be the most efficient way to remove carbon dioxide from the air and mitigate climate change. A better solution, and one that is at the heart of what many of you are doing, is to figure out ways to substitute wood products for products and materials whose production is more CO2 intensive, while also investing in forest restoration activities that can reduce fire risk and potentially increase carbon storage. I thank you for your time and we'll look forward to answering any questions during the upcoming panel discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that excellent presentation. A quick question I have, we have talked leading up to this forum, and I think the idea of carbon credits being applied to wood products is definitely has some potential for the future. But one area that I had not heard about, and I think it makes total sense, is doing mitigation efforts to reduce wildfires. We have tremendous loss of carbon going into the atmosphere every year from wildfires, and it seems like some low-hanging fruit to mitigate that.
No, I certainly agree with that, and I'm hopeful that that will be an area that gets increasing public support and funding.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Jim will be...
Mark, one more question, please. One more question, please, Mark.
Oh, yes. Please.
One question in that regard as well. So you spoke about the US market, or everything is going there in the North American area. Are there any parallel situations to be seen in Europe as well? Because I believe we have the same problems, if we have the same kind of differences in calculating the carbon credits. So is there any exchange of information in between North America and Europe? And is there any kind of cooperation to be seen? Please. Thank you.
If that question is directed at me, I unfortunately just don't have the expertise and background and haven't been involved in the broader policy discussions related to carbon markets to really know what kind of dialogues are occurring between the US and other parts of the world.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. Well, since I haven't heard of any either, and so that seems like that would be a very good idea to collaborate overseas. So now it is now my honor to introduce the remaining panelists. I will introduce each one of them, and they will give a short 5-minute presentation on their thoughts or work in the context of the forest bioeconomy. Introductions and presentations will be followed by the panel discussion, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience. Our first panelist is Dr. Philip Osano, who is the director of the Stockholm Environment Institute Africa, where he leads the Institute's research and policy engagement on environment, climate change, and development in Africa. He has over 20 years of experience in applied research, project coordination, policy analysis, and university teaching. Philip is an environmental policy expert with a diverse research and policy experience in the areas of biodiversity, climate change, agricultural policy, water and land management, and integrated environmental planning. Philip holds a PhD in geography from McGill University in Canada and a master's in conservation biology from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Philip?
Thank you, Mark, for the wonderful introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm really pleased to join this panel today and to share some of the thoughts about the role of bioeconomy in climate change. Most of what I'm going to share today is based on the experience I do have from the African continent. That's where I do most of my work, but I still hope, of course, it will be relevant to other world regions. Mark, I wanted to just really start by making 3 key critical points for the discussion. The first one is that from the evidence we know about the state of forest globally and in respect to the different regions of the world, we know that on a relative basis, Africa is the region or the continent that is losing forest most at a much faster rate compared to other world regions. From the FAO Global Forest Assessment Report 2020, which of course examines the status of and trends of more than 60 forest-related variables, for the period actually from 1990 to 2020, that's about 3 decades, Africa recorded the largest annual rate of net forest loss, a total of 3.9 million hectares over that 3-decade period. So this is the fact that when we look at the forest situation and bioeconomy largely in Africa, we are dealing with a situation where we are actually losing our forest. And in the context of climate change, this is a big challenge. The second point I wanted to make is that, this kind of situation needs to be seen in the broader context of the economy and how the economy is developing. And I wanted to point out the fact that one of the challenges that African countries are facing right now is the challenge of food security and the challenge of energy demand. These are strongly linked to the, as key drivers of deforestation. We do know that from the last 20 years, increase in food production and crop production in Africa has come mainly from expansion of land clearance, what we call extensification. So rather than from intensification. That is a problem because the implication of that is that as you clear your forest to grow food, which is of course a necessity, you are then of course releasing carbon because the forest clearing also means sort of releasing carbon. On the aspect of energy, we of course know that there's an energy insecurity in Africa. In fact, from the latest report of the Africa Energy Outlook report by the International Energy Outlook, nearly 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa still lack access to electricity. 590 million to be precise in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, another 900 million people, which is almost the entire 3/4 of the entire population, do not have access to clean cooking facilities and technologies. That means, of course, that there's a high dependence on biomass for cooking, for lighting, and for heating. And again, the biomass then means clearance of vegetation and clearance of forest. So basically, the combination of food production in terms of agricultural expansion and energy demand are key drivers of deforestation in the continent. And as we look at around the role of bioeconomy, and especially in the forest sector and what that means to climate change, we cannot look at this in isolation of looking at the food security situation as well as the energy security situation in the continent. So my third point, of course, is that I do believe, of course, that the solutions in the bioeconomy framework towards not just carbon mitigation in the forestry sector, but also a combination that allows for consideration of food security as well as energy demand. And I think building up on the presentation from Jim, there's one option that we still have to continue is, of course, what I call the public solution. We still have to make sure that some of our critical forests are put under protected area systems or conservation systems, which are actually driven from public regulation. That's still important in terms of regulating the global climate. The second thing, of course, is market-based solution. And I think we do have seen sort of like, systems where now we are seeing payment for ecosystem services or different kind of rewards that promote land use that can enable for, investment landowners to invest more in, forestation or reforestation, or actually maintaining current forest. And I think that's something that is something that needs to be looked at more critically. Concurrent with that also is to look at the value chain and the markets of bio-based products, because there could be opportunity, of course, again, to use different kind of incentives sort of to reward and to provide incentive for actors along the value chain to sort of adopt technologies that are low emission and low intensity in terms of carbon reduction. A key part, of course, to do this will require very strong and very dependable legal and regulatory frameworks, which, of course, at the moment is a challenge in the continent, but I think it's something that can be developed. So I would stop with this sort of 3 points, and I look forward to sort of maybe elaborating a little more on this during the panel discussion. Back to you, Mark.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. Yes, I'll have some questions for each of the speakers, and we'll go revisit each of you during that discussion. Our next panelist is Jeff Nuss. He is a senior advisor and impact investor focused on sustainable working landscapes, green products and materials, renewable energy and fuels, and built environment. After 22 years as founder and former president and CEO of Green Resources, Inc. and its subsidiaries, Jeff has over 28 years of business development, management, and investment experience, and more than 20 years of experience in international business development. He is a graduate of Oregon State University and holds a bachelor's in bioresource engineering and a master's in resource management and policy from Oregon State Civil Engineering. Jeff?
Let's see here. Okay. Just want to confirm you can see my presentation okay?
Yes, looks great.
Great. Well, again, I just want to reiterate, it's great to be on this panel. I think there's some great thoughts here. And Jim, I really appreciate your honesty and the challenges that I think we have ahead. As I think about it, the thing I really come back to is that we do have a call to action. I mean, if we're really going to address the things that are in front of us as a planet and to begin to address the real climate issues that we're facing today, there's a lot of things we're going to need to do. One of the things is we're going to have to invest more money. And so I think from this panel standpoint, the conversation around how is that money going to flow and where is it going to flow and where is it going to have the most impact, I think is an important conversation. And, I've spent quite a bit of time primarily at GreenWood Resources focused on investing in timberland, investing in different types of timberland, both natural timberlands as well as plantation forestry in Latin America and other parts of the world. And since moving away from that, I've really began to think about this broader sense of the value that forests bring. And I think, Jim, you hit on it towards the end of your conversation around a lot of the focus has been on the value and how you can manage your forest to improve carbon. And so I personally believe there's still areas there to improve. We can definitely do a better job of understanding what we can do differently and how we manage our timberlands to create carbon offsets. There are other areas within the sustainable working landscapes. I think about this in a very broad sense of the bioeconomy and really thinking about it in these primary themes that I think that capital needs to begin to look at and to begin to invest in. And so certainly the working landscapes is one area of it. I think that's everything from improved plant genetics and how we scale up that plant material to make it available to not just necessarily replant, to plant new areas as well and do it in a very biodiversified way. I do believe in the value of afforestation and agroforestry. I think there's a landscape out there that can go after, and we can actually truly add carbon sequestration onto that landscape, intermixed with the way in which we manage agricultural lands. And I do think that we need a more robust way in which we can actually finance that through the carbon markets. But beyond that, there's these other areas of our industry and other areas of opportunities, I think, that ought to be focused at. And that's really in this whole space of green products and built environments. And I think, Jim, you mentioned about the value of wood beyond just the standing timber itself, and really starting to look deeper into what can we do differently to encourage more sustainable, low carbon products. And I think wood is a good solution for that. And moving into this mass timber, CLT type of strategy, and really focusing on how you can capture that lower quality log into those products, because that's really the challenge, is to not just take the traditional logs that are currently being processed into lumber, but get further down the smaller log size and be able to continue to maintain that into a carbon form. I do believe in the value of biomass into energy. So I think there's an area here that we need to continue to press in on, understand the value proposition that it exists in it. And it may not be everywhere, but there are certain areas that I do think that using wood for creation of energy and steam is a good solution to the alternatives, which is, again, fossil-based solutions today. And we need to continue to move ourselves away from that. And I think the technology is getting there, where we can actually see wood as a solution for needs for fuel. So advanced fuels, whether it's aviation fuels, which is something that I've been looking at extensively. And then, to be honest, I think we need to be thinking about our built environment. And this is everything from how we build our commercial buildings, how we build our housing. And I think there's an opportunity for our industry in particular to take a real leadership role to build the right standards and to build the right products that can move that into this kind of move towards really understanding the impact of the materials that we use in our everyday lives, in the construction world, and what we need to actually continue to build out various parts of our environment. And then I know, when you look at the big companies, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, they're out there building huge warehouses and data centers. And my question to them is, if they're really about this whole question about net zero, why aren't they pressing into this question around what kind of materials should they be moving to in those facilities? And I think they are, to be completely honest. And I think that we have a way in which we can continue to help encourage that side of the built environment to really look at a move to or away from steel and concrete, or really understanding the impact that using those materials have in their footprint. So those are the broad, concepts and thoughts I've been having since I've actually moved away from GreenWood, and I've spent more time working with companies, looking at how they actually build out these ideas to really address the climate challenge that we have, and really the need to move to a more decarbonized economy around the world. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Our next panelist is Rainier Häggblom. He has supervised major merger and acquisition, post-merger integration, and organizational and strategic development assignments in the forest sector, forest products and energy industry in North America, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He has conducted a large number of strategy, investment planning, merger and acquisition assignments in more than 50 countries in the forest industry. Mr. Häggblom holds several board positions in stock-listed and non-listed companies globally. Rainier holds an MS in forestry, a master's in forestry from University of Helsinki, and a master's in economics and business administration from Aalto University. Rainier?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Everything was right except that I'm old. Yeah, and worked actually in more than 130 countries in the forestry sector. It is very interesting that I'm that old in this sector, and suddenly I listen to a presentation which is one of the best I've ever listened to. Thank you, Jim. An excellent presentation, very balanced, very fact-based view of the world. My background is that I'm a Finn. I was born in a forestry family. Practically born in a pulp mill. My father was number 2 in United Paper Mills, one of the largest paper companies in the world. Since then, I lived my all life in forest-related matters, established my own businesses, and now I have about 1.3 billion euros of forest assets under management. And my company is the leader in M&A transactions in forest industry. We have a consulting company just focusing on forests. So the only thing in life I know is forests. What is so important with this change in thinking is that, remember, this is not technically, this is not a revolution. Technically, this is something which is an evolution. Everything what we have as a challenge can be met with technological improvements. The European year for protesting against the industry and making things happen in terms of environmental protection was 1970. It's 52 years from now. That's the year when I protested against my father, who was running a paper mill here in Finland 52 years ago. We had the same issues. We looked at environmental protection. So nothing is really new. This has been happening for a long period of time. We have made great progress in terms of developing the industry to become more sustainable. When we talk about carbon, I think it's very, I really listen to the words of Jim, that carbon is a very complex issue. When we talk about carbon markets, that's only a part of the solution. One of the problems, the big problem, which is actually a very recent problem in the history of humankind, is plastics. How much damage have we made to the environment by introducing plastics? We have had a tremendous effect on sea life, birds, human beings. And at the same time, we have had all the times in our hands a product which can replace plastics. The second point, which was very important in Jim's presentation, was leakage. So it is very important that where do we invest? What kind of technology do we invest in? How do we manage the production chain so that we remove pollution? We're not only talking about carbon. Carbon is like everybody knows about carbon dioxide. But we are talking about far more efficient production systems. One of the key issues here is resource efficiency. The current humankind is pretty poor in terms of resource efficiency. And carbon cycle is one of the areas where we have shown how inefficient we can be. But it is in our world, the resource efficiency will become a very, very critical issue. When we think about then not the problems, but the solutions. The solutions that we have in terms of technology becoming much better. We have technologies in forest industry which have made us very efficient in utilizing fiber. In the future, we will be very efficient in utilizing the trees as a whole. Remember lignin, almost 50% of the trees is lignin. Lignin can be used for replacing plastics. We have hemicellulose. We have so much opportunities to improve resource efficiency. So we should not only be talking about, carbon dioxide alone. We should be talking about resource efficiency. When we talk about resource efficiency, we are representing a sector where we have a lot of solutions. Not revolution, but evolution based on existing technology. And in the end, to be honest, I'm a little bit optimistic. In current state of the world, I'm an optimist. I'm a board member of one of the largest African forest funds. I'm a chairman of one of the largest Latin American forest funds. I work with the industries here in the Western world. I'm an optimist. If we change our thinking from wasting natural resources, we think about resource efficiency, and we put people to work in order to really focus on resource efficient technologies, I think we can survive. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Rainier. That's very appreciated. Lots of food for thought there. We will expect to come back to you for some more thoughts. But first, we have to introduce our final panel member. Michael Jenkins is the founding president and current CEO of Forest Trends. He has held the position of Associate Director for the Global Security and Sustainability Program of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And in 1998, Michael was in a joint appointment as the Senior Forestry Advisor to the World Bank. Michael has worked as an agroforester in Haiti with the USAID Agroforestry Outreach Program, a technical advisor to Appropriate Technology International. And in the 1970s, Michael was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, working in agriculture, apiculture, and forestry products. In 2010, he received the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and in 2015, the Social Entrepreneur Award from the Schwab Foundation. Michael holds a Master's of Forest Science from Yale University. Michael?
Right. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, other panelists. I run an NGO, and so I think we're a bit of an odd duck in this group here, but I hope that we can bring a kind of a different perspective to this conversation. When we launched Forest Trends 23 years ago, a very distinguishing characteristic of the organization was our focus on markets and market-like mechanisms that would allow us to achieve scale both in conservation and sustainability. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to talk about here is what we talk about. Philip mentioned it, this idea of ecosystem services, the functions and the services that forests and other natural systems provide us, and that includes water, that includes biodiversity, that includes carbon. We've had a brief introduction to carbon already. But I think these are critical dimensions. My background is as a tropical forester. And what I have really struggled with my whole career is, how can we value the full package of products and services that forests provide to us? I think that is our journey and that is our task. And for me, that's going to be the angle I think about when we talk of my take on bioeconomy, is this idea of this full package of different opportunities and values. Next slide, please. Let me first turn to water. We haven't had a chance to talk about water, but I want to focus in on real experiences, real programs, and real data, rather than kind of hypothetical questions or theoretical approaches. We have been working in Peru at a national level over the last 8 years in building out what's called green infrastructure. And this is a term that the Peruvian government uses. Peru, like so many parts of the developing world, the face of climate is water. Too much, too little. All you have to do is think about the recent flooding in Pakistan and places like that. So what our program has been doing in Peru suffers with some very serious water security issues. What our program has been doing in Peru has been working across the country in 27 different watersheds, really proving that green infrastructure and sometimes combined with gray infrastructure can deliver cost-effective ways to address water security and climate security also. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but what it starts to do is document the impacts of those interventions. Next slide, please. So, well, what's interesting about Peru, that in my mind, is that it's a story that's evolving, that's really proving you can move some of these ideas to scale. So we have been working with partners in Peru, as I mentioned, and we were able to early on, again, 10 years ago, help create the regulatory framework that's critical for this. And that included building laws for payments for environmental services, creating laws that allowed public sector entities to invest in those environmental services, and then finally working with the water agencies to build a tariff on water, small tariff on water, that earmarks resources for green infrastructure, natural infrastructure approaches. So we're talking about preserving lagoons, we're talking about reforestation, afforestation, all of those different things. And what we have been able to accomplish in the last 6 years is there's now 13 times greater investment into natural infrastructure, green infrastructure approaches than there were in 2014. And this graph shows that growth, which is up to now roughly $13 million. This is a very conservative finding. We imagine in the next couple of years with the work we're doing, that investment could grow to $250 million around these ideas of natural infrastructure. So that's when we think about water and the role water can play, which of course forests are a critical element of. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So just shifting from, again, thinking about this full basket of services and products, I want to shift from water to biodiversity. Next slide. Another critical dimension in my mind of bioeconomy is the sustainable forest products that can come out of a forest that are non-timber products that are incredibly valuable. We have been working across the Amazon over the last couple of decades. We describe this as the bioeconomy of the Amazon. And I think it's an important countercurrent to what we see today, the massive deforestation that's happening across the Amazon again, which is a result of expanding cattle production, soybeans, and illegal activities. So this is a very critical countercurrent to be investing in. It involves forest-based commodities that we know, cacao, Brazil nuts, acai, that are sustainably managed and that are sort of like the interest that the forest is providing us. Here again, we have been focused on moving from projects to programs to really accentuate the scale of this. We work, one of the areas we're working in the Tupi-Mande corridor is roughly 1.5 million hectares. There are more than 8 indigenous communities that are working there. But all of this means that these are not cute products, these are scalable products that can have real forest conservation benefits, small investments with really outsized returns on those investments when you think about climate benefits. Next slide. There has been some conversation about this idea of co-benefits. Again, I think in the world that we work in, when those of us that are dedicated to forests and natural systems, there are tremendous co-benefits that go along with the work we're doing in forests. Here are a couple of just different examples from these. Illegal deforestation, huge issue globally. When you start to think about better management, when you start to think about investing in these communities, those are the best ways to deterring illegal activities. It delivers long-term sustainable management. I think Jim was talking about in a domestic US setting, what that means. Long-term sustainable management is a very critical piece of the climate package. It also builds empowerment and equity opportunities for women and youth, a big global issue that we all need to be thinking about. And finally, it delivers this idea of traditional knowledge. There are many of the elders in these regions that we work hold the knowledge of what's in these complex forests, very different than our northern forests, 450 species per acre. But this knowledge we need to make sure we preserve this knowledge and deploy this knowledge. Next slide, please. So shifting now from biodiversity, I'm sorry we have to go so quickly through this, but going from biodiversity to carbon, and there's been some conversation about carbon, and I know it's popular to be a cynic of the carbon markets, but what I wanted to do was really provide some real data points. And this is what we do at Forest Trends and the Ecosystem Marketplace. We have been tracking voluntary carbon markets for the last 16 years. As you can see in this graph, it has been a pretty sleepy place for many, many years, but that has woken up tremendously. So just in the 2021 market, we saw quadrupling of the value of that marketplace. So it's now a $2 billion marketplace where for many years, many decades, it was really roughly, $200 or $300 million. So that quadrupling is just a small snapshot of what we think is going to be a very rapidly growing marketplace. And I also want to emphasize here, let's remember these markets, these environmental markets we're talking about are all very emergent. So we've got to we've got to keep that in mind when we think about where we are today and where we could be going, forward. Next slide, please. This is just to kind of narrow in on the voluntary market to think about the forest and land use side, which are critical central elements of that. It's sort of the purple on the left. Again, I can share this slide with others going forward so you can look into it. But there's a tremendous amount of growth in that forest and land use side of the marketplace. There were roughly 230 million tons transacted. The average price of that is getting up to $6 a ton. There's a 4 times increase in the volume over 2020 again. And it's right now, it's the highest price per ton of all project credit types. Our research captures about 170 different project types, 100 different countries that were reporting transactions. So it's the most comprehensive database around this there is in the world. What I would say, and I appreciate some of the comments Jim made, what I would really point to as the challenges that we face as a community that cares about forest and land use is really this idea of integrity. There are people that are attacking the integrity of these credits. And the only way we're going to achieve greater integrity is if we can have clear transparency. And again, that is what we do at the Ecosystem Marketplace. We bring reliable and transparent information to the full marketplace. Final slide, please. So again, just to emphasize, these are really emerging markets, all of them, the carbon market, the water market, the biodiversity markets, but they're all growing and they all show tremendous potential. And I think when we think about it, I think this was something Philip said, when we think about the climate challenge, we really need to be throwing the full, as we say, kitchen sink at it. If we're going to achieve any meaningful contributions to climate, all of these need to be parts of that approach. And I think that we're in a moment that's an exciting moment to me, which is we have an opportunity to build these marketplaces. We have an opportunity to shape these marketplaces so that they truly deliver conservation outcomes and benefits to local and indigenous communities. So I'll leave it right there, but a very exciting conversation to be had.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. Now we're going to go into some questions that I have prepared for our panel speakers, but I want to, and we'll start with Jeff, but I want to, after I ask each person a question and they get a chance to respond, I would certainly invite the other panelists to join in that conversation to add thoughts if they have them. So my first question is for Jeff, and my question is, well, it starts with a statement. The World Bioeconomy Forum 2022 declaration states that the current value of volunteer carbon markets is around 2 billion, as we just heard, and it is expected to grow up to tens of billions by 2030. With such a rapid growth, is the genie out of the bottle? Meaning, can we get a meaningful reform of the voluntary carbon market with such rapid wealth creation? Does it even need reform?
Thanks, Mark. And, I think the talks that have been shared, Jim's as well as Michael's, this last one, I think has helped answer some of that question. I think the growth that's projected that you refer to is really, I think, as a result that people are recognizing the value that forests and the value of the things that we can do with forests, whether it's how we manage it differently or how we can produce unique products and diversify in which the products we can make out of the forest can actually help us get us to a better position in climate change and get us to a more decarbonized economy is significant. And I think people are recognizing that. So, of course, I think, there's always need to improve. I mean, that's true across everything. I think, Michael, you hit on it in terms of what I've thought about in terms of what needs to be focused is the integrity of the market. And I think you nailed it. The transparency question is a real good question that needs to get better refined. That maybe that's better standards, better protocols, and maybe better mechanisms by which people can really see the opportunities of the trades that are going to happen. And I have had some conversations with people, and one of the goals that they see for this kind of a market is to truly get it to where it's almost traded like a commodity. Now, I don't know if that's a shared view of people on the panel, but I know in getting to that level of tradability, there has to be all those things that's out there, which is the infrastructure, the transparency, and the protocols to make it be a viable actual market itself. So, but I think the big question and the big element is the market integrity and the need for more transparency. And to think about it beyond just the land side. I mean, there's so many other value propositions that Michael even pointed out that really wasn't talked about, is the value of water and how forests can really impact that.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other panelists who would like to address that? Jim?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that as I shared in my presentation, I'm a bit more skeptical of the growth. I do think that there's a lot of depth and growth potential in a world in which forest carbon offsets are cost, $5.80 a ton, and deliver, allow corporations to achieve their net zero objectives. But if it is the case that forest carbon offsets to actually remove carbon and store it incrementally, the cost is $60 or $70 a ton, and that becomes the standard. I think that it may be much more challenging for corporations to look to forest carbon offset markets as the way to achieve net zero commitments, and it frankly may be, they may not be able to realize some of those commitments on the timelines they've set. And so, and I think that could be the world we're moving into. And I think people at times kind of extrapolate the level of demand. I mean, yes, there is a lot of demand if you can solve your problem at a low price, and Delta Airlines can achieve net zero by buying offsets for an average price of $2 a ton. But I think it's a very different world if the only way you can achieve net zero is by paying $60 or $70 a ton, and there's got to be some elasticity to the demand curve, and we don't really know what that looks like. So I of course agree with transparency, but I look at the average price of $5.80 a ton, and I think you kind of get what you pay for, and it on its face is sort of bordering on absurd to think that $5.80 a ton is going to get you much in the way of real climate benefit. At least in, and I giant caveat, at least in the U.S. world. I mean, maybe that kind of price of carbon goes a lot further in other regions and can deliver greater climate outcomes, and therefore, it's logical and sensible to be focusing on offsets in those regions, but certainly not the case in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those are. I think those are all very good and valid points, Jim. I guess what I would really emphasize is, again, and this is what we've been doing for the last 16. We're just looking at a snapshot of what the price is today, literally, and that price 4 years ago was $1 a ton, and it was 50 cents a ton. So those prices are moving, and I agree with you completely that it's not the right price when you really think about the values. But it does, as you were mentioning, it does work decently in a developing world context where what you're doing is you're reforesting, you're restoring degraded lands. $5.80 a ton helps you get there. But I think we're going to be looking at a price that's going to be very different in the future. It's going to be $30 a ton. It's going to be something like what you're talking about. That's what we imagined 25 years ago when we started down this path, that it needed to be at that kind of level. And I think we will see it grow, and that price will grow up significantly. Yeah, so I want to caution us from taking today's snapshot and extrapolating on that when what we're seeing is really a growth and a change that's happening very quickly.
If I can add a couple of comments here, I'm doing deals at in practice, which are at a much higher level in terms of pricing. At the same time, I'm not solving the climate problem by doing these deals. you know, it's kind of business as usual. If we really think about solving the problem, it is not what we are discussing about today. It is much more related to solving technological issues, having production in the places where they should be, in resource efficiency. If we really want to move fast, this price, whatever the price is, doesn't really accelerate the technological change enough. We have to be much more aggressive in addressing the real issue in terms of resource efficiency. In addition to that, I would like to say that in my world, when we talk about the problem, we very often focus on carbon. We talk about carbon and pricing of carbon, whereas really the big issue which we are facing at the moment is actually biodiversity. And these are, you know, remarks I want to make in order to have a broader discussion about what we are actually doing to our planet at the moment. We are extremely inefficient in utilizing our resources.
Rainier, staying with you, I'll ask your question, and we've already kind of touched on answers, I think, or addressing this, but with your deep experience in the strategic development of forest product companies, do you see this carbon markets fundamentally changing the nature of investment in this sector?
No, I don't. I don't think that I'm not believing that the carbon market alone will change the industry. It is a much broader change of mentality of the people, which will make the change to happen. We, like I pointed out, one of the most important things is that we rethink resource efficiency. We are very much focused today on carbon. We are very much focused on energy. Energy, for example, is a resource where we have abundant energy resources. The systems which we are applying today are extremely inefficient. At the same time, we have locations in the world where we are wasting natural resources. So the carbon discussion is good in the sense that it has sort of woken us up in terms of thinking about the future of the planet. But the future of this planet is much more complicated than solving the carbon issue. I just want to go back to one of the points which was presented by Jim, which is leakage. Leakage means in practice is that it really depends where you produce, how you produce, how do you minimize pollution, including carbon dioxide, including all of the rest. I mean, leakage here in James's presentation was related to carbon dioxide, but it's related to everything else. It's related to how we treat the planet, how much we are wasting our resources, how much we are polluting overall. So therefore, I just want to raise this point that at the moment, one of the biggest problems is, or the biggest problem, to be blunt, is inefficiency in terms of using resources.
Thank you, Rainier. Okay, I think we'll.
Maybe,
move
Mark,
on.
maybe I would like to come up with a question in that regards. Just now it fits very good. We spoke about
Okay.
all the problems with the water systems and to get the water available in all regions. And one of the questions has been, how do we evaluate, or how are we taking into account the evapotranspiration of forests as a counteract to the CO2 emission, fixing it and washing it out by rain? How it's an influence, even by cooling the climate by forest within the evaporation, transpiration. What do we take that into account as well? Enough. It's something maybe combined with the efficiency of our resources. Who could answer that question, please? Do we take into account all these real complex influences enough?
Well, one of the comments that I've made is that when you're focused on carbon offsets, you do end up delivering several co-benefits, and one of them is the protection of water resources, and of course, forests have tremendous value from a water filtration standpoint, and it speaks to the need, in my view, to kind of broaden the scope and to accept that the outcome of entering a project into a forest carbon scheme is to deliver lots of co-benefits, and the importance of framing and valuing that investment, not just in terms of the climate benefit or the CO2 sequestration benefit, but more broadly in terms of the many other benefits that are being delivered. And I think that's probably a more honest way of thinking about what is produced from enrollment of a project in a carbon scheme. Unfortunately, the market has been sort of narrowly focused on net zero and framing all of this in terms of carbon sequestration. And I think that's an unfortunate outcome because it doesn't fully incorporate those co-benefits.
Thank you. One more question, please. One more question, please. Another one was, how can we supply investment for climate active Amazon rainforest restoring as a special item? Is that a thing what we can do? Because it's a huge area.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a crack at that. And I think one of the things again, I mentioned that we've got to keep in mind, these are all really emerging marketplaces. So currently we have just a few instruments that really are valuing, for instance, the carbon benefits of forests. And we need to think about it almost like we have, in stocks and bonds are the way that we put value into all of the built infrastructure of the planet. We need to think about mirroring that when we think about the natural infrastructure of the planet. So we need more instruments that allow us to think about what those values are and investing in those critical services. And one of the things that we've been working on is not only right now in the carbon space, as Jim pointed out, it's really a narrow set of instruments that are talking about emissions reductions, that are talking about additionality. All of those are kind of wonky terms that have narrow applications. In a place like the Amazon, we need to figure out other mechanisms where we can invest in things like existing forests, managing existing forests. If we lose those forests, all of the work we do in terms of additionality is going to be meaningless, right? That's the bank account, are the existing forests that are there. Many of them are not threatened currently, will be threatened in the future. So I think we're near what the question is, I think really gets at this answer that we need to start to build out more instruments, more mechanisms that can be related to those incredible global services that forests, not just the Amazon. Think about the the Congo Basin, think about Indonesia, think about big forest areas, think about the US, the old growth forests of British Columbia, where I just was this last week. We need mechanisms that recognize that standing volume of carbon and other co-benefits that really distinguish that product from other carbon products in the marketplace.
And thank you. Actually, that is my point when I talked about resource efficiency. Is exactly the point which we have to take into account, and it's much more than carbon. Much more than carbon.
One of the things I tried to emphasize is that in the U.S., at least, and in some other countries, we have a very good mechanism, the so-called working forest conservation easement, that by design is something that takes into account a multitude of conservation values and protects. So I would say that it's in fact in many ways it's an old tool in many respects, but it's a tool that if we're thinking about how to move beyond just additionality from carbon, but mechanisms to protect water quality, to keep standing forest stocks intact, to protect biodiversity. These are all things that conservation easements are very, very good at doing. And they've been used very successfully in the US. And, I would hope that they could be used in other places where there is maybe not an immediate threat to forest degradation, but a long-term threat. Because the idea with an easement is that they provide a permanent protection for a forest.
Okay, well, I will move on to my next question, which is for Philip, and shifting a little bit maybe towards policy. And I'm wondering how environmental policy development in Africa is addressing pressing climate goals, particularly as related to forests.
Thank you, Mark. And as I answer that question, I just wanted to make one point to add to this discussion. One is, I think from what you're seeing in terms of development of markets broadly for ecosystem services or environmental services, is that they are not a replacement to public action. So I think it's something that we need to keep in mind that public and regulatory action is still important. Markets should work where certain conditions allow them to work. And I think I really appreciated Mike's examples about the water markets and of course the carbon markets and biodiversity, because where it works, and we have an example in southwestern Kenya in the rangelands where we've been working with some of the land managers there that are providing the land for wildlife and getting conditional payments as a form of payment for ecosystem services. Initially, when this started in 2008, we had about 50 landowners signing contracts for 1 year. After 2 years, they then extended the contracts for 5 years. After 5 years, they signed contracts for 15 years. Why? Because as they were sort of getting into this market, they are building confidence among themselves and then realize that the markets are working for them because they're being paid. It started with about $15 per hectare per year. And by the time they're signing 15 years contract, they are being paid about $45 per hectare per year to sort of like maintain their land use system in a way that allows for biodiversity, but also allows for sort of like reduced degradation of grasslands, which is important for addressing climate sort of like emissions. So I just wanted to point out that, because what you then realize is that once markets emerge and as they grow, then other systems need to come in, one of which is the regulatory framework. So one of the reasons, one of the successes we are seeing in Kenyan rangelands is that now this program has grown so much, and the reason it's grown is that the government then came in and put in a regulation which provides for recognition of land use, conservancy land use as a land use that's recognized under the law. So that then enabled this kind of creation of markets. And this is important for policy, because as we look at Africa and we look at policy opportunities for bioeconomy and more broadly how that contributes to climate mitigation. One of the things you see a trend that's happening is that a lot of countries, or some countries, are developing broadly what they're calling green economy strategies. So they're trying to shift, and again, related to what Raina was talking about, how can they make economic production activities more efficient and more greener. So you see green economy programs in Ethiopia, you see that in Rwanda, you see that in Kenya and so on. But even within East Africa, actually now we've gone further to develop an East African bioeconomy strategy, which is the first regional strategy in the whole of Africa. And within that strategy, one of the key focus areas, of course, is on energy, which I talked about. Also on agriculture and food security, which I talked about, but also on bio-based industrial development. So if you think about replacing plastics, with wood-based products, I mean, that is where it comes in. So you're already creating a regulatory and policy framework to allow for investment by the industry in developing sustainable products that can come from wood-based resources and so on. But even more specifically, also the African Union has developed an African Union climate change strategy. And that strategy, which is for the period of 2022 to 2031, is very clear around opportunities in terms of forest conservation and, of course, land-based systems. So it focuses a lot on trying to develop financial markets for nature-based solutions, which, of course, also imply that forest, and forest products are part of that solution, but also linking to creating more opportunities at the national level around having investment in public payment for ecosystem programs like RED Plus programs under the United Nations. So this is important because when it comes to every country under the Paris Agreement, we know that countries have developed their nationally determined contribution. And within those nationally determined contribution, what you see is that the largest opportunity for carbon mitigation, or basically greenhouse gas mitigation, is in the forestry land use sector, the FOLU sector. So that means, I think, broadly, the policy framework is set up such that there's a lot of opportunities for coming in. I think at the moment, what happens is that a lot of what's going on is public interventions, but there's less market-based solution, and I think that has got to do with many other things, including, of course, what we hear about, the price of carbon, but also the transaction cost of engaging in this kind of carbon trading. It is, when I talk to policymakers, it is very complicated. It's very technical in terms of the work that has to be done, and nobody is there to support, whether it's local communities that are interested in getting into this carbon markets, or even national governments that need the technical support and that the analysis work that needs to go into that. There has to be some ways in which that is sort of dealt with in terms of providing the means for which these entities can be able to involve in carbon markets. And lastly, I just wanted to point out one of the important things that Rain has talked about, which is it might be actually defeatist to just focus on carbon, because people in the settings which we work in, most of the natural resources, including forest lands, are very multifunctional. So because they're multifunctional, they're used for different things. People are struggling to just see, how can I just keep my trees just for selling carbon? I need that for getting my firewood. I need that for getting my shade. I need that for my food, and so on. So there has to be a broader way, I think, not framed under nature-based solution or whatever, but I think it has to be a broader way of approaching this. Maybe emission markets. I know emission trading markets has worked in the industry, for example, in Europe, but I think perhaps if we have a broader conceptualization of emission trading that contribute to carbon reduction, but also other greenhouse gases, it might be more easy to sort of get a peak from even the policy side. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah. Great. Philip, I might add one comment there. I appreciate that. And I think you're right that from the public sector side, what regulation can be the biggest signal for demand. It can drive demand, unlike voluntary action. So that's a really critical piece of it. But also, in much of the world, when you're not thinking about the United States or Finland, for instance, tenure is a really big issue, uncertain tenure. So market-like approaches, entering into those kinds of agreements only work when you can have secure tenure. So a really important role for the public sector and public agencies is to accelerate the action to be able to deliver tenure in many of these places: East Africa, West Africa, Latin America, every place that we work. British Columbia, I mean, tenure is, you can't, if you don't have a solid base of tenure, you can't be moving on any of these ideas.
Can I add one thing, Philip? Thank you. This is a very important point which we are talking about at the moment. When we, for example, in Africa, we are looking at the carbon trade schemes. We really want to broaden the concept so that there has to be a balance between a carbon trade, local use of the forest resource, local development of forestry, and local development of small-scale industry. So this is a balance where we cannot just look at carbon alone. We have to take a broader view of the utilization of the forests, and this is a challenge, we know, but at the moment we are moving into that direction.
Thank you, René. Thank you, Philip. Thanks, Mike. And I think this is a really nice transition to my final question for Michael. We've been talking about a broader perspective, taking nature-based solutions, really addressing this broader suite of ecosystem services, not just co-benefits from the carbon market, right? So how would we scale these markets? Right? Where would the demand come to scale these markets? Would it come from the public sector, grassroots? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and maybe just going back to your point, which I think is really the fundamental issue we've all been sharing here, is we need to think of forests and natural systems as a portfolio of goods and services. And as soon as we have all of those values in the portfolio there, then we can manage for different things, René. We can manage for local wood production. We can manage for carbon emissions. We can manage for water. But it's a portfolio. It's the way we manage our financial portfolios, that balance. So, and I think that the big challenge we've all been facing for decades is scaling. How can we move from random acts of conservation and goodness into something that's really meaningful when we think about the climate challenges we're looking at? And I think it will. I'm always an optimist, even in these difficult times. But I think there are some signals that are very important signals to be taking account of. One is obviously the move to net zero. And this has been in the last 2 years, this amazing shift to businesses, thousands and thousands of businesses that have moved to a commitment to net zero. And that's going to translate into a greater demand for all of the things that we have been talking about. We have the meat, we have the deliverables for that demand in terms of the products and services that forests and ecosystems provide. I also think, Philip was mentioning the NDCs, the nationally determined commitments from countries. That Paris Agreement is gearing up. So we're now looking at a global framework that includes markets, carbon markets and other markets in that framework, that again is going to be another signal in that marketplace, because countries are going to have to step up to these commitments, and hopefully they're going to be acting in a strong way and an honest way around those. But finally, and this sometimes is hard to see in lots of different parts of the world, but I do think there's a shift in the consumer, in all of us, the awakening to the need to really address climate in significant ways, coming from young people, coming from all over the globe, coming from women, coming from all sorts of different corners. I think that is going to be another part of this tidal wave that's going to move us in this right direction. So those three, kind of a regulatory signal that's very strong, that comes from countries, that's part of a global scheme that Paris is representative of, thinking about companies that are moving to net zero and recognizing that they're not just talking about emissions, carbon emissions, but they're talking about water, and they're talking about the biodiversity challenge of the planet. And then I just see it really all around me. I mean, I used to be at dinner, with my family, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, Michael's the environmentalist." I think we're all environmentalists, and I think I think many people feel that they do that, that they behave in that way, and that's just a quick generational change. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to see the impacts of that moving forward.
Any other comments?
We are unfortunately not environmentalists, all of us. I am. We are in the panel. We are environmentalists, and the fact of life is that we are far from being environmentalists. We are using resources in a very inefficient way, and we have to establish structures which enable us to work more efficiently, take into account biodiversity and the use of natural resources. Carbon dioxide is a phenomenon which has probably woken us up, but it's only one issue which is facing the future of the mankind. Probably not even the biggest issue. I liked your view about portfolio. This is a portfolio which is global. It's like stock market. Stock market is a global portfolio. At the same time, environment is global. It doesn't help if we do improvements in one part of the world, be a small country in Europe, a small country in Latin America, when we make big mistakes in another country, in China or Russia. So we are facing a global problem where only global action makes things happen in the right direction. And we have now, probably some of us, we have seen the wake-up call, but we do not, we are not environmentalists, 100% of us. I think the minority of the world population is are environmentalists. The elite can say that they are environmentalists, but most of the people cannot say that. They just do not have the time, they don't have the money, they don't have the mentality, don't have the education to be environmentalists. We have to take the responsibility to think about environmental problems in a global scale and to find solutions which are not only related to CO2, but related to utilization of world natural resources. That's the challenge which we are facing.
Mark, I just wanted to respond to a couple of things that Mr. Jenkins said, and I think that we have to view, there's no question that there's been a change in attitudes, and I think that there's a broadened interest, as evidenced by all of the net zero commitments that corporations have made, and that's all good. That's great. I think that the danger, I think, is that some of these commitments, if they're not backed by real change and on the ground improvements, will face criticisms of greenwashing and will undermine confidence in schemes that could work if properly reformed. And I think that potential for kind of a backlash against these systems is real if there's not meaningful improvement in some of these systems. So that's one concern. I think that it's also the case that at times that these programs can give people a false sense of security that these problems can be solved through the private sector alone, and that we're actually making great progress on mitigating climate through some of these commitments, and that could delay public investments that are needed. It could delay more systemic changes and regulatory changes that really are critical, because people have this false sense of security that the private sector and the markets are kind of magically taking care of these things. And I don't think that that's a, I think it's a dialectic. I think it's a conversation that plays out over time. I thought that Philip made a great point about sometimes these private sector schemes can be experimental, and they can identify approaches to problems that can subsequently become the basis for regulations. And maybe that's the way it has to work. You couldn't necessarily start with the regulatory approach. And so my hope is that out of all of this emerges maybe some greater public investment and regulatory approaches, because I think ultimately those may be the more systemic solutions to these problems.
Excellent. Any final thoughts as we're coming near the end of our panel here? Matthias, is there maybe a question from the online audience? I think we're getting very close to the end.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay. Well, excellent. I really want to thank this panel, all the members of the panel. This has been a really excellent discussion. Thank you for engaging and all your thoughtful responses. And I think that's, I would thank you for your time and participation again. And I think that's all the time we have.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh boy, what a panel. Mark, are you with us still? It's early morning for you. It's late evening.
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, very good, very good. So that was a very hard talk and very heavy talk with so experienced people and experienced panelists. So and I think that I felt that there was no really a consensus that and it shouldn't be a consensus with these kind of topics that what we are facing. So there were different aspects, but the panelists were raising up about that this. What's the role of the carbon markets? What about the resource efficiency? And and also, what's the value of this all? What we just heard about this, that it's 2 billion and it's on the way up. And what's the content? There was 170 different type of projects which were described by Jeff. Was it Jeff who was describing? But maybe the question to you, because you have several roles also by yourself. You are also teaching the young generation. So what will be your takeaway of this? How would you like to teach your students? What did you learn out of this? What will be your message for the next generation?
Right. And that was brought up by the panelists. And that's really important. There's a lot of information here that I can bring into the classroom directly. I'll be reaching out for some of those presentations and further thought from the panelists. But I'm not sure I agree that there was, I thought there was some consensus. I mean, I think there's a lot of consensus that, the carbon markets they're certainly moving forward. There's a lot of good co-benefits. They need reform, but at the same time, there is such a groundswell from consumers and the young generation, and that they're going to demand that these things be effective. I think is what's going to happen. And so so from that demand, the proper reforms should emerge, right? If not, then perhaps a new system will emerge. But it has to be real. We're up against real boundaries, real planetary boundaries, and so we cannot just greenwash and survive. We have to. This has to be real.
Yeah. But out of this discussion, that could you dare to conclude that what would be the message to COP27 out of this?
No, I'm not sure I would dare to conclude that.
Okay, okay, let's leave that for the later phase. Anyhow, great job, Mark, and thanks for Jim, Philip, Jeff, Rainer, Michael on your contribution. So thank you for your participation. We have a very short break and then we carry on for the final conclusions. So please stay with us.